Our next speaker is Dr. Ali Mousavi. Ali Mousavi is a senior Purdue research scholar and in charge of the gazetteer of Iranian archaeological sites. He's also an adjunct assistant professor of Iranian archaeology in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures. He studied in Lyon and then obtained his PhD at Berkeley under the late David Stronach. He's excavated widely in France, in Turkey, and Iran, and he most recently has been excavating in Pasargadae. We hope he'll get back there one day. He is the author of a book on the site of Persepolis, Discovery and Afterlife of a World Wonder, and co-editor of two books, Ancient Iran from the Air and Excavating an Empire. He has also published widely on various topics, aspects of Iranian art and archaeology. Today, he will talk to us on one of the most spectacular sites in Iran, Takht-e Sōleymān, Sasanians, Romans, and Mongols, reflections on the life and afterlife of a sacred place. Ali?
Thank you so much. I would like to thank both institutions, the Getty Villa, the Getty Museum, and Dr. Jeffrey Spears, and my home institution, the Khordādbeh Center here at UCLA, Professor Shaigan, who gave me the opportunity to present a paper in this conference. And I shouldn't forget my dear colleague, Dr. Marissa Stevens, for her efforts in making sure that everything is in order. 2 months ago, approximately, when my esteemed colleague, Professor Rahim Shaigan, kindly invited me to present a paper on the Sasanians and the West in this conference, I was at first delighted. But my delight turned soon to some concerns regarding the choice of a topic pertaining the theme of this conference, ancient Iran and the West, the thinking of which haunted me for a few days. Then, one day, while working on our digitized gazetteer and leafing through this magnificent book, collection of aerial photos by Eric Schmidt, published in 1940, only 500 copies were published. I came across this beautiful site of Takht-e Sōleymān that I know since my childhood. This splendid site, ruins, known as Takht-e Sōleymān, are located in northwestern Iran in a mountainous region at 2,500 meters above sea level. The site has been built on, as you can see, an outcrop 60 meters above the surrounding plain, which is built up as a result of the overflowing of calcareous water from an artesian source that looks like a lake. In the course of millennia, the source has formed a deep thermal lake of 80 meters in diameter, and it is almost bottomless. Well, it's not bottomless. The deepest area is 112 meters above, from here. But the average depth is about 60 meters. The 20 degrees Celsius water is sulfurous and undrinkable, but it contains lime, which is essential for agriculture. And this is why you see meadowlands and everything is green, especially in the springtime. The place has been associated with some fascinating identities and events. In fact, the whole area is dotted with wonders, such as this mountain known as Kuh-e-Zindan, or Solomon's, or Zindan-e Sōleymān, Solomon's dungeon, in which it is said, Solomon imprisoned thieves and demons. The crater was once the location of another artesian source, now dry. And in this context of natural sources of water, it's not surprising to see that the site has been associated, identified as, for example, the place of Advisur Anahit, or simply Anahita, the goddess of waters. And in fact, the Bundahesht, this Middle Persian book of creation, refers to a mythical mountain, the lofty Hokaira, wherefrom the water of Ardavisur springs, and calls it the chief of the summits. Isn't this an allusion to one of these sources? Huh? And the foundation of the sacred place is also something between myth and history. And it was not until the beginning of the archaeological excavations in 1959 that we could firmly identify the ruins around the lake with the celebrated Sasanian fire temple, the Ādur Gušnasp, the fire of a stallion. The name of the fire temple occurs in a number of literary and religious sources, in the Bahman Yasht, for example, where it is mentioned as a locality near the deep lake Chichest, which has warm water that drives away the demons. And Ferdowsi mentions it as Ādur Gušnasp in the story of the mythical king Khosrow. And we have historical accounts given in Tabari, Hamdullah Mustafi, Yaghut, but probably the most, I think that the best description is by an Arab traveler named Abu Dulaf, Masʿud ibn Muhalhal. He writes that the walls of this town, Shiz, encircles the lake which is bottomless. I sounded it to a depth of 1,400 cubits. This is about 70 meters. And he got it almost right. And the plumb didn't come to rest. Its area is about 1 Jarib Hashemi, which is something like roughly 50 meters. When its waters have moistened the earth, the latter immediately solidifies to stone. 7 canals come out of the lake, and each of them feeds a mill and comes out under the walls. In Shiz, there is a greatly respected fire temple, from which the fires of the Magians are kindled both in the east and in the west. Based on the archaeological evidence, we know that the area around the lake had been occupied as early as the 5th century BC, but the monumental structures date to the 5th century AD. It seems that the sanctuary was built under Piruz, let's say mid-5th century, and Kavad, and then it was remodeled under Khosrow I Anushiravan. So the early temple was in mud brick, and then here myth and reality are mixed up. Once again, we read in the Bundahesht that Khosrow engaged in destroying the idol temples of Lake Chichest, established the Ādur Gušnasp temple on the Asnavand mountain. And some scholars argue that Khosrow I relocated Ādur Gušnasp to this site, Takht-e Sōleymān. And according to Dietrich Huff, actually he doesn't exclude the possibility that the process of architectural transformation began after the suppression of the Mazdakid movement about 528, and with the reestablishment of the Zoroastrian state church, which was carried out by Khosrow I when he was the crown prince of the empire. Well, the real fire temple at Takht-e Sōleymān enjoyed a privilege placed under Khosrow II. Here, once again, we see the formation of another legend, this time in the West, in view of historical events in connection with Perso-Byzantine wars. In 614, the Persians entered Jerusalem, and Khosrow took a sacred Christian emblem, the true cross, among other Christian relics. The true cross was taken to Ctesiphon, apparently, but then it's quite possible that it was sent further east, maybe to Ādur Gušnasp temple, Takht-e Sōleymān, where it entered the temple's treasures. Here comes our most extraordinary interpretation of these ruins. In 1937, Arthur Upham Pope led a photographic expedition to Takht-e Sōleymān. Here you see Pope with Donald Wilber, the famous or infamous Donald Wilber, his main architect. And in fact, they provided and published the very first photos of the site with this map of the ruins. Pope's wife, Phyllis Ackerman, published an article in this short-lived journal, Bulletin of the American Institute for Iranian Art and Archaeology in 1937, in which she identified the ruins with what's been depicted on this bronze, let's say, tray or salver kept in the Berlin Museum, known as Takht-e Sōleymān. You can see better here. And I'm thankful to the people in the Berlin Museum who sent me this photo. So this is a large tray. Maybe we can see better here. The main focus is this one, is this central panel depicting a pavilion or a palace known as Takht-e Sōleymān. In the early 1950s, and this gave the basis for the following identification of the ruins. In the 1950s, Lars Ivar Ringbom, the Finnish art historian, put forward probably the most extraordinary and fascinating, but maybe fantasist thesis about Takht-e Sōleymān. For Ringbom, the main motivation was a series of German medieval, let's say, literary texts, such as the one by Albrecht von Schaffenberg, the Young Titurel, for example, in which Albrecht describes the temple of the Grail, Holy Grail, in a solitary mountain, which King Titurel surrounded by a wall, and on which he built a costly castle to serve as the temple of the Grail. For Ringbom, the ruins at Takht-e Sōleymān, around the lake, within a fortified wall, recall such a castle. And in fact, according to Ringbom, Albrecht must have read or seen accounts or documents in connection with Perso-Byzantine wars between Khosrow and Heraclius. Khosrow carried off the true cross to the very temple of Takht-e Sōleymān, where the Holy Grail had been kept or was kept. Here are drawings from Ringbom's books. He published two books, one in German in 1951 and the second in Swedish. Fortunately, we have these books in the library. And based on Pope and Wilber plan of Takht-e Sōleymān, he came up with this arrangement, and then he plotted the motif on the Berlin salver or tray and came up with this reconstruction of Takht-e Sōleymān. So if this was Takht-e Sōleymān of Khosrow, Khosrow I and Khosrow II. And then this should be the place where they kept the true cross and the Holy Grail, if such a thing existed. And this idea actually inspired a number of artists, medieval artists. For example, I selected this wooden altar from a Norwegian church. The church has been restored, but then the altar is a 17th century artwork on which we see, actually we should read it from here, the capture of Jerusalem by Sasanian forces. And then here is Khosrow taking the true cross to his palace, fortified palace, or maybe the fire temple, Ādur Gušnasp. Then the Byzantine armies, led by Heraclius, crossing a river or a place with water. The Roman emperor kills Khosrow, and then he took the true cross, he restored it first. Maybe he took it first to Jerusalem and eventually to Constantinople. We know that the place was specifically targeted by Heraclius and his cavalry in 624, certainly for its importance, but maybe for being the repository of sacred relics. And we know that returning or getting back Roman standards, and in this case the true cross, was very important for Romans and then East Romans. The 9th century Byzantine historian Theophanes writes that Heraclius saw in Shiz Khosrow's own image in the domed roof of that palace, or that fire temple, according to Nicephorus, where the Sasanian king was represented in heaven, and around it the sun and the moon and the stars. Discovered in modern times by Sir Robert Kerr Porter, who visited the site in 1819, and then later by Sir Henry Rawlinson, the great Rawlinson, who identified Takht-e Sōleymān with the lost capital of the Medes, Ecbatana or Ecbatano. And then finally, I should mention the readable account of Jackson, Williams Jackson, who visited the site in the winter of 1903 and probably wrote the most romantic description of the site. Takht-e Sōleymān had never been fully explored before a Swedish-German team began excavations at the site in 1959. And then the answer to this is no. The first, it was a Swedish-German team, and then later taken over by the German Archaeological Institute. Here you see Erich Bohringer, then director of the German Archaeological Institute in Berlin, the head institute, and then Rudolf Naumann, the main excavator of the site, a World War II veteran, an architect, archaeologist, director of the DAI, or German Archaeological Institute in Istanbul. He's known for his excavations at Hattusha and also at Didima, a classical archaeologist, and then an Eastern archaeologist, Hans-Henning von der Osten. He's known for his excavations at Alisharuyuk in Anatolia, and finally Rainer Michael Bohmer, who followed a career in Mesopotamian archaeology later. Yes, the excavations did not prove or approve Ringbom's fantastic theories and ideas about the site, so a less romantic picture, but then nonetheless it yielded very important archaeological data. The Germans concentrated their efforts in uncovering a number of structures from the Sasanian period, mostly 5th century. And then they excavated the remains of the Ādur Gušnasp fire temple, the main complex here, and another adjacent fire temple with a reception room, as well as a number of structures that they dated later to the 13th century. We know that Takht-e Sōleymān, Sasanian Takht-e Sōleymān, had two main gates, one in the southeast and one in the north. Here you see the southeast one before and after restoration, with this reconstruction provided by Naumann, and the general layout of Sasanian site is like this. So you have a big square to the north of the lake with two Awans. There was a pair of them. We have only one of them. So the Awans are Sasanian. The base of these Awans is Sasanian. And two fire temples, the main one here, as you see, and then an adjacent, more or less private complex. And this is, I think, the largest fire temple and the best documented ever discovered in Iran. Here, to the north of the lake, they found the entrance to the fire temple, and this is the area where Ringbom tried to reconstruct the main pavilion of Takht-e Here, in fact, this was remodeled later by under the Mongols, but you see the main entrance that looked like an Iwan. This is the Sasanian facade, and so instead of that pavilion of Takht-e we have this in reality, and behind that is the main domed central hall of the fire temple. You see that this group of people stands on a lower ground, and this is the Sasanian ground. And the German team had to drill in some places 60 to almost a meter of sediments to get to the archaeological layers, or Sasanian layers here. The most important finds are two collections of clay impressions. The Germans found 250 of those clay impressions with the name of the sanctuary. And then later in 2007, 2008, I think, another team, Iranian team, uncovered some 800 or more than 800 clay impressions with this extraordinary impression, the figure of King Piruz. The Sasanian fire temple, or Takht-e Sōleymān, did not recover or regain its importance after the sack of 624, but survived nonetheless. And we know that there were some activities at the site in the 7th and 8th centuries. But things were there when the Mongols arrived in Iran. The Mongol Ilkhans who took over Persia finally reached these northwestern regions, and the most powerful of all of those Ilkhans was no doubt Hulagu, or Hulaku, who's known for his capture of Baghdad in 1258, when he put an end to the long period of Abbasid Caliphate. And there's no doubt that Hulagu had a predilection for this area around Lake Urmia because of its rich meadowlands and vegetations. But he died in his ordu in 1265, and his son, eldest son, Abaqa, was proclaimed Ilkhan. Abaqa is another famous Ilkhan of Persia. He's the one who mobilized an army of 60,000 men to take northern Syria and go to the coast of Mediterranean. They were stopped finally by an army of Mamluks in Syria, the famous Battle of Homs. He had a Byzantine wife. One of his wives was a Byzantine woman. And on some of his coins, we see cross, a Byzantine Greek cross. And as you see, this lush vegetation and beautiful environment of Takht-e Sōleymān attracted Mongols who needed these lands for their horses and their cavalry. The Mongols did not destroy Sasanian remains. Instead, they remodeled, and they didn't touch the area of the fire temple, but they built other structures here and there. They restored the great Awan. Here's an old photo I took from Godar, and this is the new one. One of the sides collapsed in the 1940s, unfortunately. So they basically occupied or reoccupied these areas, and they built new structures to the west of the lake. A mosque here, and a big square room here, and another one there. According to German archaeologists, they built a mosque and a place of Christian worship. Who knows? But we have some inscribed tiles dated to 1271, and this is the date, this is the year when Abagha's architects completed most of the structures. Outside Takht-e Sōleymān, they also actually made this canal, and this is a long canal, some 300 meters and 4 meters high, and this is the one that gave rise to the story of dragon. This is called Ajdaha among local people, and for them this is the Ajdaha, or the dragon, petrified by Solomon. We know that the summer residence of Mongols was beautifully decorated with tiles. Here is one in the form of a dragon, and here is this phoenix or Seymour. Most of the tiles were made in Kashan. They are signed and sent to be placed or put up in different areas of the palace. But when Abagha died in 1285, if I'm not mistaken, later Ilkhans of Persia lost their interest in Takht-e Sōleymān. By the way, they called the site Sōgolloq or Sōngolloq, and I think that you can hear the sound Su, which means water. If it is Sōgolloq, means either gushing or flowing water, or the venerated water. One of the last Ilkhans of Persia, Uljaitu, known as Sultan Muhammad Khordādbeh, after his conversion to Islam, was attracted more to his newly founded magnificent mausoleum at Sultaniya near Zanjan. It's not far from Takht-e Sōleymān. And the name Takht-e Sōleymān appears for the first time as a place where Shah Ismail, the founder of the Safavid kingdom, spent some time camping and hunting in 1504, 1505, and 1512. All this and what comes later in the Mongol period, I think, gives the image of a mystical and sacred place where, whether you want to interpret it in the context of Christian, let's say, legends, the story of the Holy Grail, or in the context of the creation of the world as told in Middle Persian texts and Eastern sources. But I think that for sure the sack of the site by a Western army, the Byzantine army in 624, played a significant role in transforming the royal fire temple of the Sasanian Empire into a place of legends and fascination and I thank you.